All right, everyone. It is now noon in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am. And so it's time to say good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant. I am the managing director here at the Program on Negotiation, which is, as many of you know, a university consortium made up not only of faculty and researchers from Harvard Law School, but actually all of the schools across Harvard, as well as community members from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Tufts University, and beyond. And PON's mission includes research, curriculum development, and executive training related to the fields of negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And we are so delighted as part of our mission to be presenting a series of live discussions around topics in our field. And to that end, I am very pleased that we have today a really wonderful discussion planned on the dispute around the Parthenon Marbles, and in celebration of a recently published book called, in fact, The Parthenon Marbles Dispute. So here today we have two speakers who will be discussing this topic. First, the author of this work, Alexander Herman, who is the director of the Institute of Art and Law based in the UK, and Nicholas O'Donnell, who is an attorney specializing in art and litigation cases at Sullivan and Worcester in Boston. So we are very delighted to have them both on board, as well as so many folks joining from all over the world as ever. It is great to see you again for many of you, and welcome to those of you who are joining for the first time. A quick recap of how this event will unfold, and then we will get right to it. We have about 40 minutes of discussion from our two presenters today. They will be presenting the history and current events around this dispute, as well as situating it in a larger context of art and restitution generally. At the conclusion of their presentation, we will, of course, as ever, have time for questions from our participants. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. That allows us to more easily field those questions and for your fellow participants to see them and vote up if they have the same one. As ever, I will thank the wonderful PON staff who goes out of their way to make sure that all of these events run smoothly, all of the communication with our many participants, and getting everything set up. So Diane Long, our events coordinator, Billy Fairfield, our program associate, and PON's assistant director, James Kerwin. This program is being recorded today, and it will be made available in just a few days on our PON events site. So if you are not able to stay to the conclusion, you will be able to access the recording or send it to someone else. So thank you very much once again for joining us today. And with that, I'll invite our two panelists to come on board. Alexander and Nicholas, thank you so much for being with us today. We are all really looking forward to this discussion. As I was mentioning at our last event, just last week, when I was announcing our upcoming events, our presenter was herself very interested in seeing and attending this discussion. So thank you to you both, and I will exit the Zoom floor and leave you the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas O'Donnell, and I'm a lawyer based in the United States, focusing on art and cultural property law, among other things. And I want to thank the Program on Negotiation for hosting today's event on Alex's book, addressing the Parthenon Marbles dispute. As we'll discuss at length today, I hope cultural property more generally and the Parthenon Marbles quite specifically highlight the principles that define some of the most important topics and aspects in negotiation. When I tell people what I do, I get two questions more often than any other. One, do you think the painting stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum will ever be found? I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that one for you today. And two, what will happen to the Elgin marbles? The way I usually receive the question. I don't endorse the term, but that's how I'm usually asked. Happily, my good friend Alex has now written the definitive book on this very topic. This question has cast a long shadow over my own career. In 1999, then as a curatorial assistant at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, I attended a conference entitled Who Owns Culture at the Columbia School of Journalism. One of the highlights of the day was a debate about the Parthenon marbles between the late journalist Christopher Hitchens, favoring immediate repatriation, and an interlocutor whose name I cannot remember, who's an academic, who was contemptuous of the idea. It was a memorable exchange, and Hitchens dominated the room with his inimicable insider dismissiveness of what he decried as British arrogance. It was wildly entertaining, but clearly the matter was not settled that day. I have spent much of the last decade as a lawyer, and a decade or two before that as a non-lawyer, claiming, discussing, litigating, and negotiating the return of art and cultural property displaced by the Nazi regime. That theft was of a scale that was without precedent in some ways, but today's topics reminds us that grappling with displaced cultural property is hardly a 20th century phenomenon. To state the case simply, the sculptures of the Parthenon are achievements of human creativity, skill, and expression that stop you in your tracks when you behold them. What are we to do with such things? Not on the compressed timeline of a human lifetime, the law of personal property, but across time. Who holds the right to claim these achievements? Does anyone? Who owns them? Should anyone own them? When does art pass from property to humanity? I thought of this just this week with the news that the Rokeby Venus in London had been attacked at the National Gallery by climate protesters. I think of Velázquez the same way I think of the Parthenon. No one could imagine such a thing could be made until it was made. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we are reminded that armed conflict and the dispersion of cultural property are not matters of the distant past. Indeed, we live in a world of hard power. The ancient Byzantine and Ottoman empires spanned vast patchworks of contemporary political systems. Is an amphora excavated in Palmyra Greek? Is it Syrian? What about the so-called Getty bronze found by Yugoslavian fishermen? Is it Roman, Italian? Who gets to decide? Is the answer different for art from Kabul today than it was 5 years ago? I think the Parthenon marbles remain the paradigmatic example of this conundrum because it exists in the realm where we don't get answers simply because we want them. Do the British get to decide, or do the Greeks? In a literal sense, it may be the British for now, but if I were the British Museum, I don't think I would feel in control. So it is for both sides. Yet both sides have not resolved it. Are we doomed to the stalemate forever? Is that a bad thing or a good thing? One thing I have seen again and again in my own experience in the realm of Nazi-looted art is that just when it seems like things will never change, they change quickly. 30 years ago, Nazi-era provenance was barely a factor in the art market, and hardly a reason that buyers would avoid certain works. 10 years after that, the market made it central. Only 5 years ago, the market had settled on a consensus focused on sales only in Nazi-occupied territory. Now, concepts like flight goods and sales in third countries necessitated by persecution are increasingly part of the conversation. The success and failure of national advisory panels on Nazi spoliated artworks is a topic for an entirely different panel. But I think it's fair to say that one useful function they can play is to deflect responsibility outside the legal and political system, including the responsibility for the decision to take something out of a national collection. Efforts at international tribunals have gone nowhere, by contrast. There is no court in which Greece can compel England to appear that would result in an order that Greece could enforce. One frequent target of repatriation critics is the institution of the British Museum itself, of course, and the very idea of a universalist museum. In recent years, not only has the British Museum, but also museums elsewhere in the UK have been at the center of scandals about theft from their collections by their staff, even. This is cited by many critics as evidence that the time for such museums has come and gone, and with it, the UK's claim of a steward of artifacts like the Parthenon marbles or the Rosetta Stone. If you thought, well, sculptures are in London, they aren't going anywhere, you probably wouldn't be in attendance. Enter this marvelous book. One of the richest aspects of this book is its ability to take a fresh look at the background of this dispute. The narrative by Alex dispassionately sets out how these breathtaking works of art came to be in the United Kingdom. Indeed, one thing I found welcome was Alex's ability to make a human portrait of Lord Elgin himself, not to prop him up, nor to make him a villain, but in fact is a somewhat pathetic figure in some respects in the world of his time. Picking up on that thread, the book adroitly avoids simplistic narratives about legal export, colonialism, and power dynamics, opting instead for what I found to be skilled nuance, even among the figures within the Ottoman administration. I cannot do this remarkable work justice, but it is with great pleasure that I pass the lectern to Alex Herman to discuss the Parthenon Marbles dispute.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that too kind introduction. I think you've situated the book and the discussions that come out of it perfectly. Now, first of all, I just want to thank the Harvard Program on Negotiation. Thank you to Diane, to Nicole, and the team. It's a real honor and a privilege to be speaking with you today. Now, I'm originally from Canada, but I've been living and working in the UK for quite some time. I like to say that I come to this issue with pure neutrality. Probably it's part of my Canadian disposition that would allow me to say that. But I don't have an axe to grind, in a sense, in this particular dispute. And what I hope to do with the book is to provide a balanced account, and one that doesn't take one side or the other and is able to critically assess both sides in the argument, but not as on the basis of what I would call a feeble neutrality. The idea here is to progress the debate, to move forward, to try to seek some kind of resolution. And with that in mind, I thought it was a perfect platform to be discussing this book, especially with a US audience, with the program on negotiation. This is really the perfect place to be trying to change the dial and affect the discussion around the marbles. This is a dispute that has gone on for a very long time. Greece first filed its claim for the restitution of the Parthenon marbles back in 1983. That was the first formal claim. But actually, in many ways, the dispute goes back over 200 years. After Lord Elgin had acquired these pieces in Athens in 1801 and the years that followed, there was a vociferous debate, prompted in part by Lord Byron, the great Romantic poet, who wrote scathing verse attacking his fellow aristocrat, Lord Elgin, for what he had done to the beautiful temple of Minerva, as it was then called, in Athens on the Acropolis. And since that time, we've had the two lines very clearly drawn. You have one camp that sees what Elgin had done as a scandal, as a crime, as a theft. And on the other side, you have people who think that great works of art belong in museums, Western museums in particular. And in 1816, there was a parliamentary debate in London about whether the British Museum should acquire this collection from Lord Elgin. Lord Elgin had gotten them from Athens on his personal account, and the big question was whether the nation should effectively acquire them and keep them in the British Museum. And what's fascinating is reading the parliamentary debates, because we see many of the arguments that arise today in relation to the Parthenon Marbles dispute, but also more broadly in relation to restitution and some of the types of cases that Nick has talked about and some of the work that he's done in relation to Nazi looted art and restitution to the families of victims of the Holocaust. We see similar arguments arising today in favor of universal museums or in Western collections. And we see similar arguments also on the side of restitution and return to a rightful place. Now, what I did in the book was try to situate the debate within the long history relating to the acquisition, to the removal of the marbles from Athens, but also the history of the claim itself. This is a history that goes back practically as far back as the removal of the marbles in the early part of the 19th century. I mentioned the debate in 1816. Greece became an independent state in 1832. And almost immediately thereafter, there were pleas and requests for the return of some parts of the artifacts that had been taken, either the originals or in some cases casts of those originals, so that they be sent back so that the Acropolis could be effectively rebuilt, because much of it had been damaged and destroyed in the preceding centuries. So that's one thing that I look at, the history of the claim. I also try to look at the Greek perspective. I spend a chapter where I break bread with people in Athens, talk to them about cultural heritage, about the marbles, about the British Museum's position, to try to get a better sense of their take on the matter. And I also go behind the scenes at the British Museum, where I talk to curators, registrars, collections managers, and others in the institution to see what their perspective is. So that's the background, I would say, to trying to analyze and better understand the dispute itself. And one of the reasons why I thought there were so many synergies between this book and the program on negotiation was this idea of providing an anatomy of a dispute, to try to understand the causes of conflict in order to see if there are any possible resolutions of those conflicts. And that's really the core of the, I would say, the last part of the book. In my final chapter, I look at the dispute and try to break it down into its different component parts to try to see what needs to be addressed if the parties themselves are ever going to be able to move this story forward. So there are three questions that I want to bring up in the very brief time that I have with you today that relate to the dispute itself and the question of negotiation. One is, why has the dispute persisted for so long? Why has it not been resolved? We're not talking about human life or geopolitics or international borders. Why is it that a dispute over what some have called in the past a few pieces of stone, why is this so divisive? Why are the points made so vociferous and so conflicted? That's the first question I want to discuss. The second is, why is the status quo no longer satisfactory? Why is there a need to push the debate forward? There are some who say, well, let's let sleeping dogs lie. Nick already referenced those in his introduction. But why is the status quo, in fact, volatile? Why is it something that needs to be changed? And then the last question I want to end on is, what is the way forward in all of this, taking all of this into account? So to begin with the first question, why has the dispute persisted for so long? There are a number of reasons for this. One of the lines that I quoted in the book from Dominic Spencer Underhill, who's a solicitor in London, which has really stuck with me over the years, is that there has been a forest of moral principles that has grown up on either side of this particular debate over the Parthenon marbles. That means that each side sees that they are on the side of morality and justice. So on the Greek side, that has traditionally meant that they feel that the marbles are an essential part of their cultural heritage and their identity, and therefore need to be returned to Athens. They also see the act as something that would reunite fragmented sculptures. So you have the head in London and the body in Athens, and vice versa in some cases. So the idea of reunifying a great monument, reunifying a sculptural scheme. So that's obviously a strong moral position. But also on the side of the British Museum, traditionally you've had the argument that these great museums like the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Louvre, and a few others are universal museums, and they need to be protected. And if we start returning items to, say, Greece, then eventually that will lead to the emptying of our great collections. So there are moral arguments on both sides, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to resolve this particular dispute. Now, the other thing that makes it difficult to resolve the dispute, and this is something that Nick has written about in his own book, A Tragic Fate, when he looks at Nazi-looted art disputes, is that there is a real conflict between the legal position and the ethical position. In relation to the Parthenon marbles, in my view, the legal position is quite clear in terms of the acquisition by Elgin and his agents operating in Athens in the first decade of the 19th century. It appears on balance that there was a legal permission from the Ottoman authorities to do what they did. And then legally as well, the acquisition by the trustees of the British Museum was sanctioned by an act of parliament. So in my view, that was a legally permissible action. Now, the morality of it is quite different. If we consider the actions themselves, certainly under the moral rules of today, they're highly problematic. For instance, Athens was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. It was the Ottoman officials that gave permission to Elgin and his agents to do what they did. That has huge moral significance. There was widely reported bribery that was being used at the time that the marbles were removed and eventually shipped out of Ottoman territory. And there was significant damage done to the objects themselves. Some of the remaining parts of the Parthenon as a monument were damaged, but also the objects themselves. So in many cases, they were either sawn in part or chiseled for days on end in order to make them more transportable. They would have been too heavy to carry away from the Acropolis otherwise. So those are things that we would consider highly problematic today. And there is no archaeologist probably in the last 50 years that would ever approve of any kind of undertaking like that. And the last reason why the dispute has persisted for so long is that we are effectively dealing with two monuments that are at the center of the heritage of nation states. So obviously the Parthenon has an iconic symbolic value for Greek cultural heritage, but so too does the British Museum in terms of the institutional heritage of Britain. You have to remember that the British Museum was founded over 250 years ago, established by an act of Parliament. It has been largely free to enter for visitors since that date. There was only a bit of time in the 1970s where they tried to introduce ticketed entry, but otherwise it's been freely accessible to members of the public. And so I think the role of the British Museum in the British heritage is also something that needs to be weighed up. So taking all those factors into account, we see how the problem has persisted for this long. The second question relates to the status quo and whether it's a satisfactory situation or whether it's a situation that needs to be changed or moved forward in some way. Now, there are a number of reasons why I think that there needs to be some kind of change, that merely keeping the marbles where they are does not make a lot of sense. There needs to be some discussion between the two sides. One obvious reason is that you have a dismembered sculptural scheme split between two different countries. As I mentioned already, you have different parts of different figures in different countries, roughly half in the British Museum and roughly half still in Athens now in the new Acropolis Museum. Other reasons relate to the ethics that apply to museums. Now, museums don't exist in a vacuum. And Nick, I mean, more than anyone would know about this in relation to the work that he's done, claiming Nazi-looted art against museums. Museums have ethical obligations that they need to follow. And if you look to the central document that establishes some of the ethical principles for museums around the world, it's the ICOM Code of Ethics. That's the International Council of Museums Code of Ethics. And it places obligations on museums to engage with countries of origin quite clearly. It talks about sharing collections as much as possible with countries of origin. It talks about being open to initiating dialogue around return to countries of origin. It's not putting any legal obligations on museums, that's clear, but it certainly sets a new ethical landscape. And that ICOM Code of Ethics has been around for 20 years or so. So this is not something new. So just keeping things as they are is not an option ethically for museums. They have to, at the very least, engage. Doesn't mean that everything is going to be returned, but it does mean they have to be open to dialogue. The other reason why I think that the status quo is unsatisfactory is that it actually ends up hurting the British Museum itself. Now, one way in which that happens is reputationally. The British Museum suffers as a result of this dispute not being resolved merely by the fact that they're referred to in so many conferences, in articles, in books, as in a sense the bogeyman when it comes to restitution, seen as an unreconstructed institution that is always going to say no matter how valid the moral claim might be. So obviously that's going to have a reputational effect on the institution. But also there's a more practical impact of this dispute not being resolved. And that relates to the loans between Greece and the British Museum. Greece as a country refuses to allow any of its public institutions to lend to the British Museum until this dispute is resolved. So that means that if the British Museum wants to put on an exhibition of ancient Greek art, which they often do, they're able to get loans from any country except Greece. Now that means that the exhibition program is effectively undermined because many of the great works from the ancient world are in Greek museums. So that's a practical way in which the British Museum does not benefit from this issue not being resolved. Another problem with the unresolved dispute is that it tends to politicize the Parthenon marbles, and it politicizes restitution more broadly, and it also politicizes heritage. And I think that's a problem on both sides of the debate. So the involvement of politicians on the UK side, usually in favor of the British Museum keeping the marbles. The past 3 prime ministers of the UK have all made statements to that effect. What it does is it effectively lets the politicians off the hook, because it's much easier for them to get up and give a 30-second soundbite saying that the marbles were lawfully acquired by Lord Elgin, they belong in the British Museum, we're not going to change the law in order to allow them to return to Greece. That's much easier than to roll up your sleeves and actually do what's needed in the case of the British Museum, which is to fund it better, to provide adequate support, and to allow the institution to move well and beyond into the 21st century. And this is something that's obviously come up in relation to the latest scandal involving the thefts and the revelation this summer about the extent of those. So that's a problem. It's also a problem on the Greek side, the involvement of politicians. Although it's brought the issue to the fore, it's made it a very prominent cultural crusade in Greece, it hasn't necessarily brought the parties together, because once you have politicians involved, you tend to have more entrenched positions, you tend to have less ability to compromise and to negotiate a workable solution for both sides. And then the third and final question that I try to answer, it relates to the way forward, the way ahead, with all of this taken into account, having looked at the dispute, having tried to dissect it as much as possible to see if there's a way forward. I think there are certain features there that need to be remembered by both sides here if they are going to try to find a sensible solution to this dispute. One is that both sides will need to abandon some of their red lines and their preconditions. And I was happy to hear the chair of trustees, the British Museum, George Osborne, make a statement to that effect last year on television, where he said both sides need to abandon their red lines and their preconditions. I thought that was quite a positive thing for him to say. It shows that he was, at least on paper, willing to negotiate. Some of the involvement of some of the politicians has not been as positive, I would say. So that's something that needs to be perhaps changed if there is going to be a negotiated solution in the future. But that is something. Each side is going to have to give a little to get a little. Secondly, it's important in these long-standing disputes where the positions have become so entrenched for each side to at some point recognize the validity of the other side's perspective. And that's something we've seen largely a lack of until quite recently, both from the British Museum's perspective and from the Greek perspective. There is a validity, as I said at the beginning, there's that forest of moral principles on each side of the dispute. And it's important for each camp to recognize the validity of the other side's perspective. And then lastly, if this dispute is ever going to be resolved, it's going to have to be done through the fostering of a strong relationship between the parties. And when I say parties here, I mean quite specifically between museums. So between the British Museum on the one hand and the Acropolis Museum in Athens on the other. It might mean that there won't be a resolution tomorrow or anytime soon, but as long as the parties can slowly work together and piecing together a relationship, one that's largely been dismantled over the years, if they're able to do that, then they'll be able to work together, develop a relationship based on trust, openness, and collaboration. And with that, effectively anything becomes possible. So I think the idea here is to look more for the long-term solution and to take small steps today to reach that solution, and not expect any kind of grand change overnight. So with that, I'll end the main part of my talk.
Great. Well, I think, Alex, that's a great summary of what makes this book so interesting. And, to sort of get into the engagement and discussion a little bit, what surprised you the most when you were researching and writing this book?
Well, what I thought was most interesting, Nick, was the fact that I went back to the history. As I mentioned, I went back to 1816. I read through the House of Commons debate, and it was remarkably modern in a sense, because you had so many of those arguments that you now hear in the restitution debate, not just the Marbles debate, but the restitution debate more broadly. So in a sense, I marveled at that fact. But it also filled me with a little bit of apprehension, because I thought, if they were having these discussions and debates back in 1816 and we're still having them today, what's changed in the interim? Are we ever going to change the tenor of this particular debate on the Parthenon marbles? The other thing that surprised me, somewhat in relation to that, just looking at the history of the dispute, are how many people have tried to get involved either from the inside or from the outside and provide some kind of neat resolution to this particular dispute, splitting them half and half, exchanges, loans, that sort of thing. I felt that looking at this as somebody who's come after all of those people, many far wiser than I am, I thought the best approach might be one of a certain humility, and to try not to impose a kind of resolution on the parties, but to say, if they want to resolve this issue, and I think there are good reasons to resolve it, here are the steps they might want to consider. Here are the things they might want to address. This is not just a dispute around ancient marble. This is a dispute that involves identity, heritage, history, across two very different countries. So there's a lot that needs to be unpicked here.
Interesting. In the book, you delve into the question of Lord Elgin's authority to remove the sculptures, and you talked about that a little bit in your remarks a few minutes ago, and sort of the conclusion you've come to as to the operative legal permission. But you also, I think, quite interestingly, with a fresh look at the interplay between the local authority and Istanbul, for example. But what did you learn from going through that examination to reach the conclusion you did, not just about where you've come to believe the legal authority was, but also about these other, moral and ethical questions, not just from the benefit of hindsight, but from the officials and the folks you looked at back in the day?
Well, the interesting thing is the debate. I didn't want to talk about it in my main presentation today, because it's been written about so much, but it is something that I feel needed to be engaged with in the book. And that's this letter from 1801, which for many years has been referred to as a firman, which is a royal edict from the Sultan. I don't think it was a firman. I think it was something else, but it still was a letter with legal weight in the Ottoman legal system. And that's been written about by so many people over the years, pontificating one way or the other on that. I looked at that and I tried to consider it in light of recent research and discoveries in relation to the situation that prevailed in Athens from 1801 and following. And there have been a number of really interesting archival discoveries in the last few years. So I tried to engage with those. I tried to bring all those documents together. I'm not going to go over it all here, but it's in the book in chapter 3. And I found, on a balance of probabilities, which, as you know, is what a civil court would use in order to assess the facts, I think on a balance of probabilities, Elgin and his agents probably did have legal authority at the time to remove those pieces from Athens. Now, morally, it's very vexing, because I think there are all sorts of problems, and these were recognized even back then. But legally, I think that the matter, it's a little bit hard to argue that these were stolen in any of the traditional definitions of that term. Now, the point in this is not to try to put a stake through the heart of the restitution argument, but is rather to say, well, maybe the legal basis is not the one that we should be using to discuss negotiating a way forward. Maybe the legal side is actually quite clear, at least on balance, and we should be focusing more on ethics, morality, and practicality, which is where I think this discussion needs to go.
Who is one character in this drama, either contemporary or older, that you feel people should know more about?
It's a good question, because there are many. And when I tried to tell the history in the early part of the book, as you said quite rightly at the beginning, Nick, I wanted to recharacterize Lord Elgin, because oftentimes in the past, when this story has been told and when the history has been recounted, it's been either by people who are very much on one side of the debate or the other. And that tends to color the way in which they depict Lord Elgin. So some people write about Lord Elgin as a savior, as somebody who saved these great items that otherwise would have been destroyed by the Ottoman Turks. There's another school that sees Elgin as a thief, as a scoundrel. And so that often colored the debate. I felt that if you actually look at the history, Elgin's role was actually quite minimal in the actual removal of the marbles. He wasn't even in Athens when the marbles started to be taken away from the Parthenon, eventually from the Acropolis. He only arrived about 9 months after that project had started. So most of the actual on-the-ground work was undertaken by agents working for Elgin. And the one, because you've asked me to point to one, the one that I think is the most problematic and the most colorful is the artist Lucieri, who is an Italian artist who was hired by Elgin, sent to Athens. And Lucieri has this, remarkable character trait, I guess, because he painted as an artist these huge murals. But his one defect was that he was never able to finish a work of art. And yet he threw himself 100% into the Elgin project in Athens. And in a strange, perverted way, that was his one completed work that we can still see today. So he's someone that I think is quite interesting. Devious, obviously. He certainly got the job done, but that has obviously led to very problematic outcomes today. So I guess he would be the person I would choose in that respect.
Interesting. We spoke in preparation for today a few times about negotiating tactics, and we were here with the gracious auspices of the program on negotiation. This is a subject, of course, where passions run very high. How do you see the tactics of various advocates helping or hurting their cause? And related to that, how do you see the public opinion in the United Kingdom in particular affected by those tactics? And is the status quo affected by that public opinion or not? Maybe it's resistant. What do you think?
It's a very good question, and it's something I at some point want to throw back to you, Nick, because I know you've been involved in some cases where this becomes a very real question. When do you quietly pursue the litigation route, and when do you maybe go more to the press and try to get attention drawn to the particular dispute and hope to get public opinion on your side? I think that that's a very difficult question to answer. It's obviously going to depend on the circumstances of each dispute. One of the interesting things when it comes to the Parthenon Marbles dispute is that because it's been such a political issue in Greece, many politicians have in a sense gravitated to it and tried to resolve it. And I would say the most recent high-profile one is the current Greek Prime Minister, Mitsotakis, who's made this very much an issue for him culturally and internationally. And a couple of years ago, he was on television in the UK, morning television, and he said he wanted to see the marbles return while he was in office. He's still in office. He won a fairly resounding majority in the elections in Greece this summer, so he'll be around for some time. And it'll be interesting to see how he brings that forward. He's obviously made a choice to make this a public matter. We know that there have been negotiations ongoing from about the time that he made that state visit to the UK 2 years ago. So it's been an interesting approach, with almost a double-sided approach, where you have statements made on television to the press and so on, but also these negotiations taking place in the background. I wonder if that's the best approach. I'm not sure. I think the jury's still out on that. Some of the statements, I think, from the politicians on both sides have been, I think, rather unhelpful, considering there are negotiations that are taking place. I think if parties are going to be negotiating on something as fraught and difficult as this particular dispute, they need to have some joint approach to dealing with the media and the public, so that one side doesn't go off and leak something to the press or make some great statement or write an op-ed in a famous newspaper, and make sure that those things are always checked with the other side before that step is taken. It doesn't seem like that's happened in these negotiations, so it's possible that they could just fan out in different directions, which could be quite toxic for seeking a resolution. So, I think just to go back to your question, it's difficult, and I think it depends on careful assessment of the situation, and those situations can change. But I would like to, at some point in the discussion, ask you that question, because I know you've had experience with that.
Sure. I think in any dispute with a public dimension like this, one of the central puzzles is, is the way out of this going to be an agreement, or is there going to be some sort of kind of dispute resolution mechanism? And in this case, and others that I've dealt with, it seems that if the status quo is to change, it will be because the parties reach something that they're not willing to do today. And in those circumstances, I think it is a high risk choice to sort of burn your negotiating partner publicly, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to need to shake hands on something that neither of you want to do today. And I think what's interesting about this debate in comparison to others is, it's so well known, and members of the public have sort of kind of an intuitive opinion, perhaps. And one of the strategic decisions that advocates face, that I've faced in other cases, is how much do you really think you can move people's perceptions, right? The factual record here is not likely to change dramatically. There isn't going to be some secret memo that Lord Elgin either was way beyond his brief, or actually, the local council of Greek culture was excited. What is some hypothetical, right? That's probably not going to happen. And so how do you nudge public opinion on these moral and ethical questions in a way that's not just people shouting at each other on Twitter, because we do enough of that and it doesn't really change people's minds?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And one of the things that's come out of this dispute and my analysis of it is that if you have a complex integrated problem, certainly one like this one that's lasted for, you could say, 200 years, it's almost impossible for the resolution itself to be just a simple slicing of the Gordian knot. There are a lot of different features of the dispute that need to be engaged with. And that includes the relationship between the parties. It includes some of the institutional disconnects that exist on both sides. A lot of those need to be engaged with. And it goes back to that point I made earlier, which is that you need to recognize the validity of the other side's position. And that's important. And unless you start doing that publicly, as you say, it's very difficult to envisage a handshake between two sides who are saying terrible things about each other in the public square.
One of the things I find interesting about the debate over the Parthenon Marbles is this kind of process and substance chicken or the egg problem, right? I am not an expert, but obviously there are restrictions on what the British Museum can and cannot do. And there's a little bit of buck passing, at least from afar, it seems, between the British government and the British Museum about who actually has to take the first step for something to change. And of course, you and the book address that better than I can quickly. But one thing that I thought of, like I said, in terms of my own experience, is something that's helpfully come out of the Washington Conference in 1998 on Holocaust-era assets and Nazi confiscated art, are these alternative commissions, which are far from perfect. And I've had, sort of successes and frustrations with some of them. But the UK Spoliation Advisory Panel, I think, is highly regarded by just about everybody involved. And in some senses, like I said in my remarks, it gives a little bit of cover to pass the decision. And it's interesting to me that I don't see a lot of that in the public discourse as a possibility. Commissions can be sort of unhelpful for punting on hard questions. But do you see any hint of that as a possible change in the status quo in the United Kingdom, for example, of taking it off the shoulders of the British Museum trustees or the government to look at this differently?
I think for this dispute, it would be hard because it's already a moving target in a sense. It would be hard to impose an administration like that at this late stage, especially if the negotiations are ongoing. I think just generally, I think there is space for that. And I think that might come out of some of the recent changes in the laws on charities in the UK. So there might be some role for at least the Charity Commission or a standing body that would advise them on restitution. But it would be for rare cases where there is a morally compelling reason for returning something. So there'll be exceptional cases. I don't think that approach would apply for the marbles, just because of the very complex and nuanced moral positions on this. But I think there could be space for other things to be discussed in that respect.
I'm going to jump in here.
I could go on all day, but Nicole,
well, I
you're
know,
back.
and I could
wanna hear
listen
from
to
our
you all
audience.
day, as I imagine could many of our participants. However, given that folks have set aside a finite amount of time, and I want to make sure that we get to some questions from our participants. But first of all, thank you both. This is really edifying, and I know that it raises a lot of questions for people. So we have a lively discussion going on in the Q&A. I'm going to try my best to synthesize some of these questions. So the first one that I'll pose is from Camilla Novak, who's a frequent PON community member. So great to see you here. Thank you for asking. And Camilla's asking about if a precedent, or if we might see movement on negotiations because of the recent return of Parthenon sculptures by the Vatican in early 2023, and if you feel that might have any incidence on these negotiations.
I think it has a subtle effect on the landscape. There are fragments. I mean, the 3 fragments from the Vatican collections, those have now been returned to Athens. And there are a few small fragments in different European countries, including in France at the Louvre, for example. Those are obviously things that would affect the larger climate, I would say. But I don't think they'll have a direct impact on the negotiation. And I think it's a little bit dangerous to assume that they necessarily would. I think largely because of the role that the Parthenon marbles, what used to be called the Elgin marbles, the role that they played in the development of that great institution of Britain, which is the British Museum. I think much more of a role than any of those other pieces played in their respective collections. So as a result, the museum is much more closely attached to that part of its collection. So I think it's important. I think it was a great initiative, obviously, by the Pope, the Palermo Museum, and apparently there's discussions that the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna is going to return its fragment to Athens as well. So there could be a kind of a snowball effect. But I think the issues in Britain are a little bit more particular, and it's a little bit more sensitive. So I don't know if that is a major game changer.
Okay, great. We've talked a lot about the legality of the original acquisition, and there is some discussion, some folks who agree with your analysis, Alexander, and others who don't. But notwithstanding, what the point is, that is one of the stances maintained by the British Museum, is that there was some legal justification at that point in time. For both of you who operate in this legal world, how would you square that with the idea that lots of laws that were in effect 200 years ago are now no longer considered legal? Has the idea of a legal acquisition played out in restitution in other cases where something that might have been deemed legal at the time is now viewed as illegal, or I guess where the unethical aspect would trump that today, so that something has been given back? Does that make sense?
Yes. So I think it's relatively rare for there to be kind of a retroactive consideration of the legality of something. I mean, the entire different topic of discussion about the law of armed conflict and the 1954 convention and how that's progressed over time. Lots of things that we wouldn't tolerate today are sort of de facto in place and probably not going anywhere. Won't name names. I think it's relatively rare for those to form the substance of a legal dispute. I mean, the big, I think, counterexample is the Nazi era, but that, I think, is because in part in the immediate aftermath of the conflict and of the dispossession, even though the issue kind of lay fallow for a few decades, the victorious Allies put a lot of principles in place, even as the conflict was raging, that they were going to treat these transfers a little differently than usual, and they were not going to respect what appeared to be sort of legal formalities and valid transactions at the time. They were going to apply a different perspective to it. That was not easy. I mean, that took sort of the largest restitution effort maybe in history in the MFAA program, and there are still disagreements about the extent to which it applies. But I think the reimagining and revisiting the merits of the acquisition is something that continues. But Alex, I welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, I think what's happened in I would say in the last few years, certainly in relation to spoliations during the Nazi period and the artworks that are held at museums or in private collections today, and more broadly around colonial era takings and cultural property and antiquities that come from one place but have ended up in a museum in another country, it's moved the discussion more into the ethical space. And I think the Parthenon marbles, because of the questions around the legality at the time, it's kind of held it back in a sense that it can't just be a purely ethical matter. And I think the ethics, the landscape of the ethical world when it comes to cultural heritage is vastly different today than it was 5 or 6 years ago. And we've seen huge changes, and we're continuing to see changes. But the ethical space is an interesting one because it's not somewhere where you can have prescriptive results the way you can in the legal space, where you could say if you do this and it's an illegal act, then this will be the consequence. With ethics, I think it's more nuanced, it's more textured. It relates to an assessment of various factors. It relates to an ethical priority rather than an outcome, if you see what I mean. So I think that it can guide people and institutions, but it can't necessarily prescribe a particular outcome. And I think that's difficult. I think it's difficult for cultural institutions to deal with that feature. And it's difficult sometimes for claimants to deal with that because they'd say, well, this was taken and we believe it belongs to us and we should have it back. An ethical approach is going to be somewhat more nuanced than providing a clear, easy answer where there's a winner and there's a loser. With ethics, to me, it's more about engagement, collaboration, the ethics of transparency and care and so forth. So I think there are other features at play when we talk about ethics, and I think those are very much at the fore now in the cultural discourse.
I'm going to paraphrase a question from Michael around what distinction, if any, do you see and has other precedents made of artifacts that were taken from a specific site, like removed from a building, as is the case here, and cultural objects that were found or were in possession of someone else and have, migrated to museums over time? What weight do you give that or see in precedent for other restitution cases?
Well, obviously, I mean, it makes the claim for restitution of the Parthenon marbles all the more compelling because we know that they originated in a single monument, which was the Temple of Athena, known as the Parthenon. But we have to remember that the way in which they were collected in 1801 and the years following was not always directly from the monument itself. Some of the pieces were effectively excavated from the site. The Parthenon had been targeted by the Venetians in 1687 and had blown up. So a lot of the pieces had actually been scattered around the site and had to be kind of reassembled. I think that the fact that they came from a single recognizable monument definitely makes the argument very, very cogent. But you have to take into account the fact that they've spent over 200 years as part, in a sense, of a museum collection. I don't think that's the end of the story. I don't think that means that we just let it fall where it lies, but it does mean that side of it needs to be engaged with, where I said that you need to recognize the validity of the other side's position. Otherwise, I can't see a negotiated outcome in this particular dispute.
Great. A question that we have about, and there are numerous ones about applicability to other cases. So do you see any distinction between sort of the British Museum's policies and negotiations? And I know that a lot of this is secret and we're not exactly sure how they're carrying this out, and restitutions to other countries, cultures, and places. Is there something particular about these marbles that we can point to that might be different from their policies about returning other objects?
Well, probably with the marbles, just because it's such a well-known dispute, it does put them in a slightly different category. But that said, I think that any museum, whether it's the British Museum or any museum, or even a private collector or an auction house or an art dealer, they always need to operate with a clear policy and procedure. So I think that if you have a principled approach and you say, we're open to discussing return in some cases, but you have to make a compelling case on whatever the bases might be, considering various factors. I think as long as you're clear in terms of what the procedure is and what the policy is, then it's going to lead to fair outcomes, or it has the potential to lead to fair outcomes. If you have a hardline rule, which is largely what the British Museum has had for many decades, which is we won't discuss restitution, then you're going to lead to frustration, a feeling of unfairness, a feeling of mistreatment, a feeling of injustice. And that just allows the situation to persist and linger and not to be capable of resolution. So you need a new approach to these things. You need to be open-minded. Doesn't mean everything's going to return, but it just means that every potential claimant has at least a fair trial, in inverted commas.
Great. We have so many questions. I think I'm going to end this kind of on a negotiation note. So we talked a lot about not burning the other side because you would possibly need to arrive at a point of compromise at some place. For those of us in the negotiation community, we think a lot about how to bring parties together, mediators, et cetera. What do you see as the kind of process role, from what you understand, for mediation in this space, or external? We talked about organizations that might intervene, but are there specific folks who have been designated that you know of that are working on this situation as intermediaries, or is it really is the process totally off the books in terms of visibility right now?
I want to hear what Nick says. Is that okay?
I mean, I don't know the answer in terms of the extent to which there are intermediaries involved in the conversation about this in particular. I don't know. I mean, I think it would, speaking, in the cultural property space, I think it would be tremendously helpful. I think that is.
Has that the way it's been played out with other restitutions, Nicholas? I don't know. Or has it been
quite
really
often? Yes, quite often. Yeah, yes, and I think whatever the form it takes, whether it's a sort of quasi-adjudicatory, you win, you lose, or softer recommendation, whatever it is, I think these situations, I mean, those groups can come to conclusions that people disagree with, and I have in certain cases, but just adding a group of people who are not themselves involved in the debate to try to understand it, try to understand the two sides, I think is tremendously helpful. I think one of the great advances in the Nazi looted art realm of the last several years has been the increasing tendency of the national commissions to recommend various compromises rather than the painting should stay or the painting should go. I think that has loosened things up a lot and has made museums more willing to participate in the conversation because they don't feel like they have as much to lose, and claimants, more able to continue the conversation, to a resolution that isn't all or nothing.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Nick's just said. In a general sense, for restitution, it can be extremely helpful. I do think with the Parthenon marbles, just because of their notoriety, because this dispute has lingered for so long, I think it would be very difficult to impose a third party at this stage. I know people have talked about UNESCO and the Intergovernmental Committee, and Greece has had a claim before the Intergovernmental Committee at UNESCO since 1984, and it still sits there. It hasn't been resolved. I think there is no international body with the reputation and the track record that could intervene at this late stage in discussions on the Parthenon marble. So I do think it's going to be party to party, but I do think this is quite a unique case. Generally speaking, for restitution, it would be great to have a mediating body or mediator involved that could bring the discussions forward.
Great, thank you very much. All right, we have had so many questions in the chat. I apologize that we're not going to be able to go to all of them. Yes, this program has been recorded, so if you do want to review, we have also put the contact information for our two speakers here today, as well as links to their works if you would like to read them and learn more. Thank you to them for their time. Gentlemen, this was really lively. And again, I think we could have tacked on another 30 minutes. So I so appreciate this wonderful discussion. Coming up with the program on negotiation, we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events on European peace building and the situation in Ukraine, respectively, or perhaps at one of our various classes that we're going to be hosting in person or online. We have our fall schedule actively enrolling and are about to launch spring registrations also. So thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you very soon online or perhaps in person. Thank you.